Good morning, Mr. FitzGerald. I'm very sorry to have kept you waiting. There was an equipment malfunction this morning which prevented us from proceeding. It wouldn't have affected you giving us evidence here, but there are something like 150, 200 people out there listening remotely who can't be here because of current restrictions. But who need to be able to see and listen and follow your evidence as it's given.
Yeah.
So we had to make sure that they could do that.
Okay.
We've had a week where we've had the odd bit of equipment malfunction, but there we are. So I'm sorry you've been kept
don't worry.
waiting.
No
But thank you very much for being here. Now you have to be sworn, Mary.
State your full name.
Christopher Francis FitzGerald.
And you have the book in your raised hand, so repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Mr. FitzGerald, you took over from Peter Stevens as chairman of the Board of Trustees for the Macfarlane Trust in April 2007 until you stepped down in April 2012. Is that right?
That is right.
And you tell us in your witness statement that you are a qualified solicitor who was in private practice initially, and then undertook several roles at the NatWest Group, and from 2001 onwards at the Financial Services Authority, in particular the chairman of the Financial Services Authority's Independent Regulatory Decisions Committee, and you were on the Financial Reporting Review Panel until 2012. Is that also correct?
That is correct.
And currently, you are a non-executive director of various listed and unlisted companies, and also a lead independent director of another company. Is that correct?
Only the last that is still current. The others were over the period of time since 2001, or thereabouts.
Before you took up your chairmanship of the Macfarlane Trust, had you had any prior experience of being a trustee on a charity?
No, I think. I had been a member of my college's finance committee, the college being a charitable organisation, but that was the only other thing that was around the same time, a bit before, and I still am.
And how did you find out about the vacancy for the chairman at Macfarlane Trust?
It was advertised in the Sunday Times.
And what drew you to the Macfarlane Trust?
What drew me? Well, when I saw that advertisement, it struck a chord. I have unlike others, still have no personal experience or familial experience of this great tragedy, but I am of an age that remembers the AIDS epidemic all too well. I knew of, didn't know personally, people who suffered from haemophilia, and I remember thinking that when I was looking at this, I also noticed this advertisement, that it was somewhere where I might be able to bring such experience as I have to help, and thinking that it was such a terrible combination of events that if I could help and if people wanted me to help, then I would be very happy to do it.
So you applied, and can you tell us a little bit about the process, the interview and so on that you went through?
Well, I started, first I went to see the people, it was called Kingston Smith, I think, were they at the people who were conducting the recruiting. And then and I'm not going to be able to remember exactly what the intervals of the time intervals were, but I then did have certainly one long interview with what appeared to be the whole board of the then board of the Macfarlane Trust. I don't remember whether it was complete, but it was certainly a lot of people there. I think there was a second round, but I don't remember that being particularly long. But that's how the process went. It was a full interview with the members of the Board of Trustees.
There was a period between the announcement of your appointment and you taking up your appointment. Do you recall?
Yes,
that?
Yes.
That?
Yes.
What occurred in that period?
Well, my appointment as a trustee started, I think, from 1st of January 2007. My appointment as the fact that I was going to become a trustee was, I think, decided upon by the board in October of 2006. And my involvement with the trust during those 3 months was limited to attending a strategy day, which was very interesting and very informative for me. Once I'd become a trustee as of the 1st of January 2007, for the following 3 or 4 months, I think it was the 1st of January, I was visiting the office from time to time, obviously talking with Peter Stevens in particular from time to time, and sort of prepping, if you like, until I actually took over formally at the end of April.
You say in your statement that you had extensive briefings both from Peter Stevens and from Martin Harvey.
Yeah.
Martin Harvey being the chief executive. And he was the only chief executive you worked with.
In my time, yes.
Yeah. Extensive briefings from Peter Stevens and Martin Harvey at around or before taking up your role as chair. What sort of information did they hand over to you in that period? What did you learn about the Macfarlane Trust?
I don't remember being given any literally having any written papers handed over to me. But I certainly, if I was in the office, certainly once a week, Martin in particular would have told me what was going on, how they went about, what they were doing, obviously what the objects and aims of the trust were. Peter would have talked to me about that. I didn't see him every week, certainly, but I saw Martin regularly during that period. And so acquired background, if you like, which I put into, or became put into practice when I actually took up the official position as chair.
And can you remember what the key issues were as identified by Peter Stevens and Martin Harvey at that stage?
Well, I mean, the key issue, as always, was the one of funding and the inadequacy of it. In terms of that issue, and the fact that we were a trust, a charitable trust, and that our objects and aims were defined by reference to need. And the combination of the two, the inadequacy of the funding and the charitable requirement for need to be established in order for funding to be provided to beneficiaries, was a very difficult challenge to manage. And that I became familiar with during that period. That period was also against the background of the funding long-term survival paper that had been sent into the Department of Health, which was a plea for substantially increased funding. As I recall, there had been virtually no increase in funding since 2003, and the challenges for the board, the demands on the board or the charity were, ever greater.
And the funding bid you've just referred to, is that the I think it was called the long-term survival
Yes,
report
yes, I think that's right.
submitted to the Department of Health by Peter Stevens.
Yes, it was, yes.
Around about 2005. Does that...
Yes, it was. It had been in their hands for a long time. We hadn't had any, as I understand it, we hadn't had any response until it was effectively rejected, and that rejection had taken place not long before I first became involved with the charity. So that was all part of the history or the background that Peter in particular in his case, but also Martin shared with me.
And just to be clear, because we've heard evidence from Peter Stevens already this week, those that are listening, that was the funding bid in which the Department of Health were asked to significantly increase the
It was doubling
funds.
it. It was a doubling.
A double, up to about seven and a
Seven and a
half
half,
million.
as I recall. Yeah.
What did you understand your responsibilities and duties as trustee and particularly chair of the Macfarlane Trust to be?
Well, as a trustee, like all of the trustees, our obligations were obviously facing in two directions. One, it was to do the best we could for all of our beneficiaries. And doing the best we could involved making every effort to obtain more funding from the Department of Health. That was on that side of things, and towards the beneficiaries was to provide with that funding whatever we could to help them. I think I made it clear in my written statement that the policy of the trust had always been and remains so throughout my time and still until the response to the Archer inquiry report changed matters fairly fundamentally, had always been to prioritise the needs of what we came to call primary beneficiaries. There was just a little bit. When I arrived on the scene, people were called, our beneficiaries were called registrants and infected intimates, and neither of which expression I personally found particularly appealing or helpful either. And so it was agreed that they would all together be primary beneficiaries. But the priority there was their needs, which meant that the needs of the broad category of dependents, which includes wives, widows, and so on, and children, well, by definition, were secondary. That wouldn't mean that they were eliminated, far from it, but we were extremely conscious of the fact that we were not only were we not doing as much as we would really want to for primary beneficiaries, we certainly weren't doing as much as we wanted to do for the other beneficiaries.
And what can you recall about the reasons why you, prior to Archer, continued with that policy decision to prioritise primary beneficiaries over secondary beneficiaries?
I suppose it was because we felt those who were suffering the medical consequences of the conditions by which we all knew they were then afflicted meant that we ought to give them more to support them than we could provide to others. It was also the case, I think, although this was less true perhaps by the time I was in the chair, that certainly in the earlier days in the Trust, the afflicted were dying much earlier and with much younger widows and who in many cases, if not most cases, would have been keen to move on, if I can use that expression, and who would not therefore want to be dependent on or rely on the charity in order to carry on with their lives. That was, I say, less true, much less true by the time I became involved, because the death rate was very much lower. And widows were that much older, and so we were all the more keen to do more help for them to the extent that we could.
Just turning then to the way that the trust operated at board level, it's right, is it, that there was a committee, the NSCC, in place
yes,
when
National
you were there?
Support, NSSC, yes.
NSSC, sorry. And that committee was responsible for making decisions on applications for grants and so on, was it?
Yes, yes.
And were they also responsible for drawing up guidance or guidelines or policies that the for grant giving?
Well, I think yes. I think it's fair to say that they were responsible for developing the policies, not least because they were the ones who were as close as possible facing the applicants. But all policies were then approved or submitted for approval and often sent back for further consideration by the board. But that was the order in which it occurred. So far as the decisions were concerned, the response to the applications would have been developed in the office first, and then presented, I think, with a recommendation, but at any rate certainly presented to the committee, who would then go through each one and make a decision which would be communicated to the applicants. The applicants had the opportunity to ask the committee to think again or to reconsider, and if depending upon the outcome of that process, it was then possible, if there was still, if the matter was still outstanding, if I can put it that way, then it was referred to the board for decision. I have to say I don't remember that actually. I can remember occasions when it did happen, but it didn't happen at every board meeting. We didn't have appeals, if you can call it that, at every board meeting by any means. But there were certainly occasions when the board had to make a decision, yes.
Just a couple of questions arising from that. First of all, in relation to the NSSC, I understand that you were not a member of that committee.
No.
But we see in minutes you attending quite a lot of their meetings.
I saw that. Sorry, I'm interrupting you.
No.
It was more than when I looked through those, it was more than I remembered. But no, I was in attendance either, if I did stay on because the consideration of applications was always later in the meeting. And the reason why I was there was to the extent that policies were either being developed or reviewed, partly in order to provide guidance, if that's the right word, as to what I thought the board's position either was or had been or would be, and also to take part in their discussions in that regard. But I took it as a matter of principle that I would not take part, not least because I was not I, but the board led by me, were the appeal body if it came to it. I did not take any part in the discussions. Even if I remained in the meeting, and as often as not I left before the applications were considered, I didn't take part in the consideration or let alone determination of the applications.
And the other members of that committee were other fellow trustees?
Yes, they were, yes.
And in relation to the determination of applications as they came in from beneficiaries for grants and so on, the inquiry has documentation and heard evidence yesterday that certainly before your time, but the process was an application would come in, staff would consider it, and if it came within what came to be known as the office guidelines,
right, yeah.
i.e. certain limits, staff could approve it. But if it was beyond it is beyond those limits, and right. Or then it would go up to the NSSC. Was that the right? The
yes, I think that's right. I think with one slight gloss, I believe that even though the decision would have been made in the circumstance you described in the office, the fact that they had been made, the decisions that is, would have been reported to the NSSC. So the NSSC would have known, what grants had been applied for and what grants had been approved. And I say that not least because my recollection is that when it came to the board, when the NSSC reported to the board quarterly, we had a list of all the grants that had been made, and that, I believe, included office approved as well as committee approved.
You have already told us that the chief executive throughout your time with Macfarlane Trust was Martin Harvey. What was the relationship between chief executive and chairman of Macfarlane like during your tenure? How did you see the two interacting?
Well, he had his job to do and I had mine. But it was, I think, I was, as I've said, I think already, I was in the office at least once a week. And he was always there for. It wasn't as if it was a relationship which occurred once a quarter for meetings. I was made aware, I was going to say constantly, but certainly frequently, of all the things that were concerning him and others in the office, and if I could offer advice or guidance, then I would do that. He would certainly keep, if he was involved in anything, particularly which involved external affairs, then he would keep me involved as it was developing. He wouldn't necessarily copy me on everything by email that he was involved in, but quite a lot of times I did get copied in on things, yeah. Or he would report to me directly.
So he was there to, one of his roles was to implement decisions made by the board.
Of course, yes.
Did he have a role in advising and guiding the board about policy decisions and strategy and so on?
Informing, I would say. I'm not sure. Advice, I don't think he would have seen it as his role to advise the board, but certainly the development of proposed policies would have started with him and in the office, and would have come through, if it was one of those sorts of policies, come through the NSSC, and he was certainly took a full part in discussions about policy at the NSSC, less so at the board, other than on a reporting basis.
Approximately 6 weeks after taking up the chairman role at the Macfarlane Trust, you were called to give evidence at the Archer inquiry.
Yes, I had forgotten that. I mean, I knew I attended.
Yes,
I remember that, but I put in my witness statement that I had attended a day, and the reason why I'd forgotten that I'd actually said anything was, as opposed to Martin Harvey saying a lot, was that I had indeed only been in office for 6 weeks. But I've seen the, obviously I was party to the submission that was made, but that was not drafted, as you would expect. It wasn't drafted by me, hopefully improved on a drafting basis by me, but certainly not developed by me. That was Peter Stevens and Martin Harvey who would have done that. But as chair, I remember now, because I've seen the papers, I did make a short statement at the beginning of that day's evidence, or that part of the evidence that day.
So I was going to turn to the written submission made to the Archer inquiry, but I think given that you've said that you didn't play any part in writing that, it's probably not very helpful.
No.
So can we look then at your oral evidence to the Archer inquiry, which is, in fact, yes, it's ARCH 605.
Yes, I have that. Well, I have the summary.
Yes, so
and
that we'll
there's
have
the text.
So this was, you gave evidence, I believe, on the 3rd of June.
Yep.
Before we turn to the actual transcript, can you recall whether or not there was any discussion at board level about the line to take or what should be said?
No, is the short answer. I mean, the submission itself, I don't have in front of me the minutes of the end of April board meeting, but I'm confident the submission itself would have been shared with the trustees and would have been discussed with them at previous meetings, but I honestly don't have a picture in my mind of that happening. But it certainly was, trustees were very much party to the whole thing.
Yes. So your evidence starts at page 34 of the full transcript.
Yeah. 35,
No,
I think.
so
35.
One page on. Electronic 35. Yeah. At the bottom of that page, we can see McFarlane Trust. So
Yes, maybe proceed. Yeah.
Martin Heavey, Martin Harvey, and.
And then I appear at the top of the next page.
You do. I'm going to read out some of this transcript. I'm going to start at what you say. So if we go over the page, then please, Schumacher. You start off unsurprisingly by explaining you've only just recently taken up the chair. And then you say, at line 13, what I'd like to do is, without going through the paper itself, just develop the theme of the commitment of the government and to contrast that with the delivery of the funding, which I would say has been committed. And you then go through and set out the historic commitments that the government had given to the McFarlane Trust. Yeah. And then if we go over the page, Schumacher, to page 36, about halfway down that page at line 14, you then say you can contrast this with the delivery. The reality is that there has been no effective increase in the funds available to the McFarlane Trust since 2003, and we are told, as you've heard in the context of the Eileen Trust as well, we are told not to expect any increase in 2008 and 2009 either. And then you develop that theme over the page, page 37 of the transcript, 38 electronically, and you set out there the latest correspondence that has been received by the Department of Health about the difficulties in funding. You refer to a letter on the 2nd in November 2006, and you quote there the Department of Health. I explained the financial difficulties facing the department, and I'm being asked to reduce all budgets. And then you describe, and this was the SOP to us. I am aiming to secure the same level of funding, 2007, 2008 as 2006, 2007, which you point out was at least some advance on the previous threats of actual reduction in the budget. And then can we then go over to the next page, please, Schumacher, and pick up what you say there. At lines 7 following, you're talking about the paper, and you describe what you say in there. You're saying we said that. I think you're there referring to the paper. While the establishment of the trust recognised the uniqueness of the situation, at the same time it carried the risk for the trustees that it might be perceived to have moved the plight of the beneficiaries from being a political issue to an administrative problem. And we said it would be most unfair, not only to the trustees, but more importantly for the beneficiaries, but also for the administrators. In order for the trustees to achieve the objective in the trust, which must have been a political intention, a renewal of political commitment to those objectives is required. It is wrong for our beneficiaries, we said, whose lives are continuing and will continue, to be blighted by errors within the NHS, that they should be further disadvantaged by financial stringency within the NHS. This is what we said to them. I would simply wish to reiterate, I would simply wish to reiterate that it is simply unacceptable on any basis, whether you call it moral, legal, or whatever. It is simply unacceptable that the consequences of the greatest catastrophe in the history of the NHS should be constrained by the current financial difficulties or incompetencies in the NHS. And then you say in the next paragraph, I concluded in our paper, and I will repeat that what is needed is a renewal of the political commitment, no amount of arguing the toss, dare I call it that, with notions about what the cost of living is and what the difference in the cost of living is going to be make any difference. This is a political matter. And then skipping next paragraph, when the trust was set up, and repeatedly since then, ministers have accepted the obligation, whether you call it legal one, moral one, or you simply call it a responsibility. They have accepted responsibility. We, the Macfarlane Trust, are a charitable trust. The trustees are individuals, volunteers who want to do what they can to help people in these tragic circumstances. We are charged with the duty under our trust deed to relieve the needs of our beneficiaries. We cannot perform that duty unless adequate financing is provided. And to do that, the government has got, the politicians have got to recognise the fundamental change that has taken place in the needs of our beneficiaries, resulting from the fact that they are now expected to survive for a full lifespan, God willing, whereas when the commitments were originally given, they were all expected to be dead within 4 to 5 years. And there are realities here, new realities, that are going to continue and must be recognised.
May I just ask? This was in 2007. My memory may be very inexact, but the credit crunch hadn't yet really happened, had it?
No.
So this was financial stringency at a time when there was no pressure from the credit crunch.
No, there was no credit crunch. No, the financial crash occurred certainly not before the end of 2007, and its impact was felt in 2008-9.
Yes.
Yeah, no, that's definitely so. The other thing, if I may, Chairman, I'd like to add to this is that something that occurred to me as I was preparing all of this, but I have not seen in any of the papers because it probably isn't there, but I would like to share a clear recollection that at least one of the meetings that I took part in with the Department of Health over the years, when we were talking about, in exactly these terms, about the NHS's difficulties ought not to be our difficulties and so on. I remember being told that actually the Department of Health had effectively two budgets. One was the NHS, and we were not in competition with that. And there was another budget for all the other things they did, and that's the pot which we were sharing in. Now, I remember saying at that time that I thought it was unacceptable either way, but it just struck me as odd that we should find ourselves in that sort of this sort of differential between two competing pots, if I can call it that. I don't know that it adds anything to the general understanding, but it just stuck in my mind that they had this approach. And I don't know whether the second pot, which we were apparently sharing in, if that's the right word, was competing with the NHS. The NHS, as we know, is always underfunded. Everybody says that, and therefore it must have more and more money. But they were actually telling me at that time that actually you're over here, so don't worry about whether the constraints on the NHS are affecting you, because you're in that pot. Very strange, but that is my recollection. And I can't tell you which of those meetings that occurred in, but I certainly clearly remember it being told that.
Do you recall whether you had any feedback from any of the trustees about what you'd said to the Archer Inquiry, a public platform about the Department of Health? No, I don't think. I mean, nothing I said, I believe, nothing that I said was in any way controversial so far as the trustees were concerned. The inquiry's heard evidence over this week about a certain reticence on the part of the Trust before your time in the earlier years about criticising the Department of Health. Is that something that you experienced? Was that
No.
still in play when you were with the Macfarlane Trust?
No, I mean, I think that we had to show an understanding, I was going to say respect, but an understanding that the people who were administering affairs at the Department of Health were not, substantially at least, responsible for the funding issues which we were seeking to address. I've always taken the view in, whether it's in negotiations, discussions, arguments, or whatever, that it never helps to become overly aggressive with somebody, because they will just retreat. So what you want is to draw them in. And so you may have seen several occasions where papers have referred to trying to develop a discussion with the department officials in a sense, or with a sense of partnership. But that never stopped me, and I certainly don't remember any trustees suggesting that we hold back when it came to trying to make these political, the points at the political level that I was making in the statement. In the statement. And indeed on several occasions afterwards, when usually there was an opportunity to write to a new Secretary of State or a new, whatever he was called, Minister for Health or something, that they, to make the point again, and pretty as firmly as I could, that it was up to the politicians to make the decisions. It's not actually for these people to do that.
We can look at one of those documents. Should we take that one down?
I think, if I may just come back to actually the question you asked me, was I aware of what whether the atmosphere or attitude rather was different earlier? I could understand it having been so, because of the great uncertainty about continued funding, and that goes back to my point about how far you can push people before they actually turn their back on you. But they had reason to be concerned that not only might they not get any more money on an annual basis, but they might not get any money at all. And so that might have explained any reticence there was before. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, not at all. So just developing that somewhat. Was, given that you had criticised, well, it could be seen as being critical of the Department of Health on such a public platform, did that, to your knowledge, have any impact on the relationship between the Macfarlane Trust and the Department of Health? Was it visited upon you?
No.
In the future?
No, it certainly wasn't. It was perfectly well, as I recall, perfectly well understood. The fact that the words had been said, and that as part of much broader submissions anyway, on many fronts, the Department of Health knew they were under attack, if you like, throughout the whole of the Archer inquiry process. When they saw the report of the Archer inquiry, they would have seen exactly. Archer said no more than what the Trust was trying to say. Well, I said a lot more, but I mean, we were all very much on the same page.
You mentioned writing to ministers of state and so on taking up their appointment. We can look at one of those letters. It's MACF 5016_039. And it's a letter, if we go over to the second page, we can see it's a letter from you.
Yep.
And we go back to the first page. It's a letter from you to the Right Honourable Dawn Primarolo MP, 5th of July 2007. And you say, I'm writing to welcome you on your appointment as Minister of State for Public Health Protection. And you've written in similar terms to the incoming Secretary of State. And then you wish every success in discharging the heavy burden of responsibility. And then you go on to set out the background to the Macfarlane Trust. And you make the point that predecessors have repeatedly made statements recognising the hardship and great distress of the beneficiaries. And then you mention the funding long-term survival. That was the funding bid that you spoke about earlier, and the rejection of that by Caroline Flint. And then at the bottom of the page there, you say it appears to the trustees that the grounds on which the submission was effectively rejected by the department in July last year amounted in reality to the recent well-publicised financial difficulties of the NHS. The trustees' position is that it's simply unacceptable that our beneficiaries, whose lives have been shattered and will continue to be blighted by what has been described as the worst ever treatment disaster in the history of the NHS, should be further disadvantaged by financial stringency within the NHS. So very much making the same point in correspondence with MPs and indeed Secretary of State.
And I think you'll find much the same approach was taken even in 2010 when there was the new coalition government came in, and at that stage I was writing about the inadequacy of the response to the Archer inquiry, but in much similar terms.
Can we just look at a couple of documents before I get to my question? So the response from Dawn Primarolo is at a DHSC 304109_016. And here we can see that it's date stamped 25th of July, to you from Dawn Primarolo, and she says, sets out her understanding of Peter Stevens' meeting with Caroline Flint in July 2006, and what an increase in funding of £400,000 was made, and she says, I am advised that the Trust has presently provided the departmental funding of just over 3.7 million per year to meet the needs of its registrants. I am sorry that you consider this level of funding to be insufficient, but as I appreciate you are aware, departmental budgets have to take into account a range of competing pressures. And then she says, please to consider a revised case from the Trust on behalf of your registrants in due course. So not any movement from her, not giving much away, but effectively, yes, you can come and try again if you want to in the future. Is that how you read that?
Absolutely, and she gave nor did her officials give any indication of what part of our submission could helpfully be revised. So, as far as we were concerned, that was the door being slammed shut in our face.
And we can look then at a meeting with officials. It should be MACF 5012_131. So this is a minute of a DH, assuming Department of Health, Macfarlane Trust update minute, 28th of October 2008. You can see that you've attended with Martin Harvey and Nicholas Fish, and there are Brian Bradley and Glenn Clark from the Department of Health. Were they civil servants?
Yes. I don't remember Glenn, but I do remember Brian Bradley.
And then if we turn to page 3 of this minute, we may well come back to this minute in due course on different themes later on, but there's a discussion about funding and reserves, and he pointed out, I think that's you at the top of the page there, he pointed out that if the Trust does increase their regular outgoings, then the reserves will need to be at a higher level. Martin mentioned that the Trust were grateful for Brian's efforts on the caveated assurances that he was able to give regarding the Trust's funding, and that the trustees were content with the new funding policy. Christopher said that the Trust would continue to make the case to the department for an improvement in their funding.
Just pause there. Where exactly are we on the screen?
We want to go back a page, I think.
Sorry. I'm sorry. Yes. Right. So if we look at the first page, under 2, Macfarlane Trust current funding and reserves policy. And there's a discussion there. Christopher referred to the position there'd be no increase in the Trust funding for 2009 to 2010 and for the following 2 years. And you say he reiterated that this amount of funding would not be enough for the Trust to meet its objectives adequately, although he understood the department's position. And then there's a discussion about reverting to an annual settlement. And the Department of Health has said they will look at that. And then you say, Christopher added that if the DH accepted this request, this would be seen as a positive demonstration of the DH's support for the Trust and the spirit of partnership.
Yeah. The request is for the annual payment, whatever it was going to be, to come in at the beginning of the year and not get paid in quarterly. That's what that was about.
And so that's a meeting in which you're saying, in terms to the Department of Health, unless you give us more money, we can't meet the objectives adequately.
Adequately, yes, absolutely.
There was effectively no, that wasn't sufficient to get any increase in funding either.
No. All the support, what is recorded there, that is that it was at least something that they would pay the £3.7 million at the beginning of the year rather than in quarterly instalments, and that was at least something, particularly against the background where whatever. I've forgotten what the date of this was, but I mean, we were into the financial crisis by that point, and so therefore our investments were looking pretty sick.
Yeah, so that is October 2008.
Yeah, that's we were right in it then. Yeah.
Would it be right to characterise this toing and froing between the Macfarlane Trust and the Department of Health at this stage on funding as having reached a bit of an impasse? You're pressing for more; they're continually resisting you. Can we look then at MACF 5045_009? This is the annual report from 31st of March 2008. And if we go to page 5, we can see that the chairman's statement signed by you on the 28th of November 2008. We go back to page 3, please. We can see the beginning of the chairman's statement. And you set out that it's been an eventful and challenging year, and made more challenging by the Trust seeking to not just maintain but enhance activities, despite no level of increase in funding from the Department of Health. And then the next paragraph, you say this about the Archer inquiry. The insufficiency of the Department's funding relative to the demonstrable needs of the Trust beneficiaries leads the Trusts to look to the report of the Archer inquiry as a vital platform on which both to make renewed representations to the Department and to lobby parliamentarians and others who might be able to cause political influence to be brought to bear. The Archer inquiry was set up to look into the original cause of the disaster, etc. The report will provide a valuable opportunity to draw attention to those needs and the inadequacy of the means available to the Trusts to relieve them in the way and to the extent that the Trust deed requires of them. So would it be fair to characterise your view at this stage that really the Archer report, the Archer inquiry, was really the best chance of being able to improve matters for the Macfarlane Trust?
Absolutely. It was effectively at that time was the only chance, because as you've already pointed out, we were getting effectively nowhere with the Department of Health, and certainly as advised by the officials, the politicians who were responsible for the department were not responsive either, except at a very basic level. But this was the great opportunity for public pressure to be brought on the politicians in order to achieve a transformation in the financial affairs and well-being of our beneficiaries. And that was what it was. We were looking to it to provide the lever for us to be more particular about how to go about delivering what we hoped and expected Archer would recommend. And this was, I think, before he reported. Yeah, I think it was.
And do you think, or did you get any sense that the fact that the Macfarlane Trust had significant reserves during this period may have been a contributory factor to the Department of Health not being willing to increase funding?
Not at this stage, no, because we had been consistent in our approach to this with the department, that we had, because they had provided no satisfactory commitment to future funding, we had an obligation as charitable trustees to keep reserves that would continue to provide, such as to continue to provide our beneficiaries with support, and not risk the situation where the tap would simply, if I may put it that way, it would simply be turned off. And the advice, I believe after discussion, not least after discussion with the Charity Commission, that actually meant having at least a year's forward cover, plus the cost of administering the trust. That, what we would have done, heaven alone knows, because if it really had, the tap had been turned off, we would no doubt not have simply paid out one more year. We would have tried some way of trying to reduce it gradually, but it fortunately never came to that. But we did obtain in time, and I'm not going to remember the exact calendar dates now, we did get a commitment communicated by officials, it must be said, that I initially and then the board agreed were sufficient for us to be sure that we would at least get funding every year indefinitely. And it was on the back of that we decided we could safely, in terms of our charitable obligations, or obligations as trustees, we could aim to reduce the reserves to 6 months forward cover. This was never going to be easy to do, in truth, but that was what we were determined to do, and eventually we did. But
so that precisely what you've just outlined is recorded in the 31st of March 2008 annual report under the reserves policy.
Right.
Does that accord with your recollection in terms of timing?
I think that's right. Yeah, they must be right if it's what it is. If it's there. Yeah.
And what it says is the new policy, the new reserves policy, is that the trust should move over time towards a reserves level roughly equal to 6 rather than 12 months cover of its total expenditure. Yeah. And in terms of figures, at that stage, the reserves were at 4 million, which was said to be 12 months of grants plus the cost of running the trust for a year. Yeah. And so that presumably means that you'll be moving towards £2 million for the 6 months.
Yeah, that was thought to be appropriate. It was always expected to be a gradual reduction. And I can remember a figure of 3 million being quoted at some later stage. And I also remember somewhere in a board meeting it being noted that it could take us 7 years to reduce the reserves to the level that we felt at a pace with which we felt comfortable. But this became, an increasing issue, as I'm sure you've seen in throughout the papers with the department.
So it might be helpful to look at that meeting that you've just referred to about the 3 million. It's MACF 5018_006. This is the right meeting. So this is July 2008 meeting. If we go down to the bottom of the page, matters arising. The board received the chairman's memorandum and proposed policy statement on reserves. The chairman alluded to the reserves, why he felt that the assurances from the Department of Health in respect to future funding was sufficient to enable the trustees to consider a less conservative approach to the maintenance of the reserves and maintain them at a level which would meet forward expenditure of 6 months for the disbursement and operating costs, plus a buffer of 10% in the first instance to make some allowances for market variation in place of the current policy of 12 months. And that's what we see then finding its way into the annual report, is it? Mm-hmm. And then it goes on, future reserve policy be incorporated into the annual report, appropriate to calibrate the reduction in the level of the retained reserves, and accordingly the proposal stated a target reserve of 3 million at the end of 0809, with a formal review prior to any further diminution in the value of the portfolio. Is it right to understand that this was very much driven by you?
I don't know. I'm driven. I think I'm not sure I would accept, no doubt, because I was in the chair and the discussions. I had the discussions with the department, with Martin Harvey, of course, about this subject. I would have been reporting to the board and telling them what I would recommend to the board, and this on the back of reporting the commitments as I saw them that had now been given. But certainly the trustees shared, I believe, the trustees, I didn't hear them say otherwise, they shared the concern that we'd had from the very beginning about maintaining a level of reserves which were appropriate for charitable trustees, given our commitments to our beneficiaries. And I believe that the calibration that is referred to here was very much in accord with the trustees' view. So, all right, I no doubt led it, but I certainly didn't drive them to a conclusion.
And do you recall having discussions with the Department of Health over this time about the reserves policy?
Other than in whatever meetings that had taken place, which I think I was reporting on there.
Yes,
yeah.
And can you recall what the?
I think my recollection is that they simply said, "Well, that's good news. Thank you."
And was it something that you felt that, or that the board felt that they had to almost seek the approval of the Department of Health on, or was it something the board was acting independently?
No,
just
the
informing?
The board in all matters acted independently of the department. I mean, I say that, as we were talking about earlier, if we had done things that have provoked the department, we might have risked them taking some sort of adverse action against us in terms of funding. So, it's a balance in these things, but certainly no, they did not lead us to any conclusions at all.
Can you recall
until much later? I know you're going to come back to that.
And can you recall what the plan was for using up the reserves at that stage?
Well, the plan was simply to develop further developments of the welfare policy that would have provided for increased, particularly grants, but some increases in regular pay, which I know did happen, and also over time to provide more help to the non-infected beneficiaries. That was the plan, but the development of that plan took, as you will have seen, took time.
So if we turn now to MACF 5015_067. So we have been looking at documents from mid-2008. This is now a meeting minute from January 2010.
Yeah.
Can we go, Shemek, to page 4, please? That big paragraph in the middle, the chairman then directed the discussion towards the trust's reserves and how this could best be utilised. And then it says, after receiving the post-Archer settlement from the department, the reserves, if they retain their current value, would appear as some £5 million in the final account. And just pausing there, is it right to understand that the post-Archer settlement at that point was around about £2 million or thereabout?
Yeah.
So looks like about 3 million in the reserves then. With the post-Archer, it's going to go up to 5. Due to the risk that the department may try and recoup some or all of these funds, thought needed to be given to dispersing in the order of 4 million in reasonably short order. And then 1 million will be the level recovered to cover 6 months forward spend and management costs. So is it right to understand that at that point, so in January 2010, the reserves policy was still for 6 months expenditure?
Yes.
Given that post-Archer, the expenditure of the trust had been reduced, and we'll come and look at that in a bit more detail later, but it had been reduced because much of what the trust was doing was now being dealt with by the MFET.
Yep.
The 6-month reserve policy in effect meant £1 million worth of reserves.
Yeah.
And that hence the reference to really needing to get rid of £4 million in order to be compliant with the reserves policy.
Yeah.
And then what do we understand by the risk that the department may try and recoup some or all of these funds? Where did that come from at that stage? Were the departments saying anything of that nature?
No, I don't remember. Apart from, as we've seen, the reserves, the fact of our reserves were a constant point of reference. They'd not. I don't recall them at any stage. At that stage, saying, if you don't reduce your reserves quickly, we will reduce our discretionary funding, or the funding we give you for discretionary purposes, until you have. And that's what that minute is referring to as recoup. There was never any question of them taking it back, but simply saying we won't give you any more money until, or we will reduce our funding until you have used it up. But we were, rather as in the previous years, we'd been concerned that there was a risk that the department would simply not continue funding appropriately, or even at all, if it was appropriate or adequate. At the back of our minds, we knew this was a manoeuvre that they could take. And as we will see later on, that is what they did indeed threaten at a later date.
Yeah, so if we just look at the annual report then that seemed to trigger those conversations that you just alluded to, that's MACF 604_017. MACF 604_017. Ah, 4 sevens. Sorry, MACF 5 zeros, 47. Sorry, Shimak, I've given you the wrong. _017. So that's the 31st of March 2011 annual report, financial report. We go to page 9, we can see the reserves, the beginning of the reserves policy at the bottom there. And if we go over the page, second paragraph down, with much the greater part of the government's commitment to the support of the trust's beneficiaries now take the form of non-discretionary disbursement. Accordingly, the funds available to the trust for discretionary support have substantially reduced to at that point 2.3 million in the year under review. The sum currently required to provide 6 months forward cover has been reduced to 1 million. So that's what you spoke about earlier. It doesn't set out there what the level of reserves was at that time. Can we turn over to page 12? Can we get it from the information here? There's an opening balance. There's an investment portfolio value, other net assets valued, and a closing balance. Can we tell what the reserves are from that information?
Well, that's the total assets, aren't they?
Yes.
That's five. That's five, just over 5. It's the matches the 535.
Yes.
535.
So we're looking.
So you're talking about an investment portfolio, which is effectively the reserves of
Yes.
4 million. Yeah.
Yeah. So still looking at that stage at needing to
Yeah.
reduce by 4 million.
Yeah. Well, by 3 anyway.
Yes, by 3 anyway.
So some progress had been made, in other words, but not as
If we
much
could-
as we needed.
And then if we go to MACF 5061_104, we get to the meeting that you've spoken about with the Department of Health. You see that you've attended with Martin Harvey, Linda Haig, and Gillian Brown. Who was Gillian Brown? Can you remember?
No, I don't. 2011. I think yes. I don't mean to be rude to her, but I don't remember her. I was aware that I think she was brought onto the staff in order to assist Linda Haig, who was responsible for the finances. But I don't remember much more about her. Forgive me if she's listening.
The first paragraph, Ms. Wright acknowledged receipt of the annual report and accounts, which we've just looked at. And then if we go down to the bottom of the page, the second paragraph, Mr. FitzGerald returned to the issue of reserves as set out in the trustees' report and chairman's statement, and then you set out the history of the reserves policy. And if we go over the page, Mr. FitzGerald advised the MFT were working hard to reduce reserves through its disbursements policy. The trustees were now planning to press ahead with a broad review of beneficiaries' circumstances, similar to that conducted by Mr. Barnard on behalf of the Trust in 2003-2004. So we've heard evidence this week about Mr. Barnard's long-term review. Is that what you're referring to there?
I don't. To be honest, I don't remember. It was 2003-04. This would have been in preparation for the the funding long-term survival paper, and I don't now remember who Mr. Barnard was.
So it looks there as though the trust is really only at this stage beginning to formulate plans about how to reduce reserves. Is that accurate?
Well, it says we're working hard. I mean, it had been working hard certainly for the whole year and was making some progress, as we pointed out earlier. And by this stage, as you can see, I said it would take another 2 years to get it down to. I'm not sure I recognise that figure. But the Department of Health said the figure was in line with their views. So 2 years and the time frame seemed to be acceptable to the Department of Health then. Acceptable in the sense that we didn't feel we were running a risk of them turning around and saying you'll have to use it as part of your regular payments.
Well, I think what you're suggesting in the next paragraph is exactly that. A period of 2 years appropriate to reduce the reserves, and you're there saying not the 1 million but the 100 to 200,000.
This is. I should say this is a minute or report of the meeting which was prepared by the Department of Health. I don't think we ever saw their minutes. you will have seen in your papers there have been minutes that Martin Harvey typically would have prepared and I would have reviewed. So which is why I say I don't recognise that 100 to 200,000 level. It doesn't seem to me to make sense. But certainly a period of 2 years, I would have been saying then that it would take us that length of time to get down to our 6-month cover.
So your recollection is that the reserves policy was still, as set out in the annual report, then you would have been saying 1 million in 2
years. Yeah, 6 months cover.
2 years.
I would have certainly said 6 month cover, and you can see, at the top of that page, you can see that's referred to. So I don't recognise the 100 to 200k.
And the next paragraph, Ms Jaycock is informing that funding of all charitable bodies under considerable scrutiny, and there's discussion, and then the following paragraph, you say Macfarlane are better placed to do something about their high level of reserves, and suggest an agreed figure within 2 years. And the DH stressed that the time for this reduction needed to be much sooner. And Ms Wright acknowledged Macfarlane's efforts to build up income levels for widows, but stressed again that the reserves needed to be reduced sooner rather than later. And you reiterated that change cannot happen overnight. Realistic time frame to reduce reserves would be 2 years. And then the following paragraph is where Ms Jaycock said the MFT should recognise that the reserves might have to be used for a time to fund the Trust's current commitments to beneficiaries, as financing was under tight review, and the Department of Health Finances was limiting the pot of money to cover non-NHS programmes. Is this what you're referring to?
Yeah, it is, yeah.
Ms Wright offered room for negotiation. She suggested submitting a paper setting out why it was necessary to maintain the reserves and how Macfarlane intended to use them. She stressed that she could not guarantee this would be effective, but it might help to make it clear to Finance why the reserves should not be required to be used in lieu of a discretionary allowance next year and possibly longer. When Ms Wright reiterated that Macfarlane might still have to use some of its reserves for the discretionary top-ups, Mr FitzGerald said that the beneficiaries would then expect that any reserves used in this way should be refunded later because they had been held back for their benefit and should be used for them and not to fund the Department of Health's commitment to continuing discretionary funding. And then the bottom paragraph there, Mrs Jaycock said that the only reason for suspending discretionary payments would be the existence of reserves. And then we see the action on the next page. Macfarlane to produce a proposal demonstrating clearly the means by which reserves would be reduced to 100 to 200k. Ms Jaycock added that it would be closer to 100 by the end of 2013, and the paper should be submitted as soon as possible and no later than the end of the first working week in January.
Just looking at those figures, they're missing a naught compared to the position from which you began.
Yeah.
And to reduce it by a factor of 10 would be to reduce it from 6 months to rather less than 1 month.
Yeah. That's why I say I don't recognise that number.
But it's a repeated figure.
I know, it's a repeat of what was said in the previous page, absolutely, yeah. So I can't help further with that, but certainly the trust, obviously after reporting all of this to the board, the trustees were determined to reduce the level, but still, as far as I was concerned, to reduce it to the 6 months level, but also recognising that it would take time, and certainly not less than a year, and more likely 2 if one was being sensible about it. And sensible in the sense of there's one thing that one of the problems with the reserves, in terms of we have the issue facing the department, but as far as beneficiaries were concerned, the point that was made there, we felt strongly, and not surprisingly the beneficiaries felt even more strongly, that this was in a sense their money, which we were holding on, as far as we were concerned, to provide for future times, whatever the length of that future was. But whatever happened, it was their money. And so there was at one point when we realised that this sort of attitude was being adopted in the department, there was a moment rather, when at least one, and I think probably among the user trustees, if I may use that expression, felt that, well, it would not have come from the trustees, because they knew perfectly well what our position was, but it would have come from beneficiaries and representative beneficiaries who say, well, why don't you just dish it out, distribute it all among all of us? And then, of course, we then had to come back to the sad fact was that we couldn't do that, because we were charitable trustees. Our obligations were to relieve need and so on. And just dishing out a dividend to everybody would not have been, we would have been personally liable if we'd done that. However much we would have liked to have done it, but there we are.
Why was it that the reserves were not distributed and were still significantly in excess of the reserves policy by many million, or by millions, at the end of 2011?
I think, the only answer to that is that it was taking time to develop the policies that we wanted to have in place in order to be able to use the reserves what we consider to be appropriately. The most challenging thing post-Archer was that we were looking to develop policies that would provide much greater support for the non-infected beneficiaries. We still recognise, as you will have seen, that the implementation of Archer, so far as the government's implementation of it is concerned, still left us in a position where we still needed to provide some support, not inconsiderable support, to some, if not all, of our infected beneficiaries. But the greater emphasis was needed to be, we felt, to move towards supporting the non-infected beneficiaries. And the challenge there was first of all to find them, the ones we didn't know about, and we knew very well that there were quite a few who we had not kept in touch with us, and then secondly to establish what their needs were. So this was not going to happen overnight, and that was why, there was a figure of 7 years at one point. That was actually I should withdraw that, because that was pre-Archer, but post-Archer, on any realistic basis, it was going to take 2 years to do that. There was some progress that had been made in the year before, or the year of Archer, I think, but not much, not enough.
From the meeting minute that we looked at, where the Trust is telling the Department of Health in December 2011, we're thinking of doing a review much like the one done in 2003. It looks as though the Trust really is at the beginning of that process. Would it be fair to say that the Trust was slow in dispersing the reserves? Would you accept that?
Well, I would accept that we would have liked it to have been much faster, put it that way. I don't recall, beyond the explanations that I've already offered in terms of the difficulty of identifying, or the challenges in identifying the beneficiary groups in question, that there isn't any other reason why we should have gone faster. I don't think I can add to that. It just took time. And indeed, it was still another year. This is end of 2011. This meeting, 2011,
December
end
2011.
of 2011. So it was 12 months, I think, after that, after the end of my time, when the policies were eventually adopted. I'm going to say July 2012, but I wasn't there. It was then that by then the policies were adopted, and I hope, not for me to expect, but I hope they were then implemented with sufficient speed that they were able to make, by then, an effective and rapid reduction.
So when was it in 2012 that you ended?
April.
So the last financial report would have been yours, would it have been the next year's?
No, I would have done my chairman's statement. My last chairman's statement would have been the 2011 one. Roger Evans would have written the one for 2012. My recollection is that at the 30th of April board meeting, not 30th, end of April board meeting, which is my last one, that this matter and the policies to be adopted in order to provide the greater support for the non-infected community would have been discussed at that meeting, and I believe implemented or approved for implementation at the next one. But I can't swear to that. I believe that's my recollection anyway.
Do you accept that the consequence of having of the reserves having built up or remained high, however you want to put it, over those years were twofold? First of all, that over those years, particularly the bereaved community didn't have access to additional funding that they might have had.
If you're suggesting that these policies could have been adopted earlier,
Yes.
Well, until we knew how the government was going to respond to Archer, there really wasn't anything very much we could do beyond aim to reduce to the 6 months level of cover. And certainly after that, we could have, we were in a position rather to accelerate that process.
And just to give you, Archer reported in February 2009, and the government response was in May 2009. Does that sound right?
Yeah. And so, we could see, we then spent, as you know, quite a lot of time and energy in trying to get the government to understand that they were not even implementing the philosophy or logic of their own response, which was the reason why we were going to have to continue to provide discretionary support as well as the non-discretionary payments that were going to go through what proved to be MFET. So a lot of time and energy was taken up in doing that, but the recognition that we were going to provide, we would hope to provide more for the non-infected community, was certainly apparent then by the end of 2009, and thought was being given to how we were going to do that, how we were going to provide that further support. That's for sure. But it also said we actually resorted at that stage, back in, this is by then probably in 2010, to appealing by national advertising in the national press, I don't remember exactly where, for widows and others affected to come forward, because certainly what we did not want to do was to, disperse all the reserves, or not all the reserves, but sufficient part of the reserves at that stage on those we did know about, with expecting at that stage there to be a considerably greater number coming forward. So I don't doubt things might have been done more quickly, but certainly there was no lack of effort on the part of the trustees, or indeed of the office or the NSSC, to try and move things forward.
And just for completeness' sake, as you've indicated, you stepped down as chairman in April 2012.
Yeah.
By then, during your time there, the Department of Health suspend funding as they had threatened to?
No. But the threat was fairly clear. Well, as you saw in the minute that they recorded. No, but they didn't. Why, we would have expected payment. No, I'm sure not, because if they were going to reduce the payment for 2012-13, we would have known about it by the time of my last board meeting, and I don't recall there being any threat threat, but the threat was there. But the fact that the threat was there over those last months, 12 or otherwise, it was a cause of concern too to the primary beneficiary community, because they, or rather, how we were going to respond to that threat, because they didn't want to see some of those who purported to or did represent them, they didn't want to see the reserves being dispersed in toto over in this direction, when they were concerned that they had needs that might not then be as fulfilled as they would like. So there was a balance to be drawn. I wouldn't want to put too much emphasis on that, but it was a subject that was brought up as to how we should balance the use of the reserves in that way, and whether we shouldn't keep more in the longer term for the primary beneficiaries.
I'm going to ask you now about the policies for grant for regular pay to beneficiaries, both before Archer and after Archer.
Mm-hmm.
Before I do that, can you recall whether or not the McFarlane Trust published a handbook during your time there? Does that ring any bells with you?
No, it doesn't. I mean, what I do, if it's in the same area, if you like, I mean, the office guidelines were certainly a familiar subject for me, and the office guidelines were available to all beneficiaries. So, but I don't remember a handbook as such, no.
So do you recall how beneficiaries were informed of policies or guidelines for regular pay or single grants or changes in those policies?
I think it's it was incorporated in the welfare policies.
And how was that disseminated to beneficiaries?
I think the fact that they, particularly with regard to regular pay, the fact that they existed was well known. I don't think they were. No, I'm not going to be sure of it. An awful lot of communication was done through the quarterly newsletters. The more informal communications through the partnership group and indirectly through the Haemophilia Society will have provided, channels of communication. But the office guidelines were known to be available. All beneficiaries knew the office guidelines were there in the office. They were not sent out as a, whatever it was, 20-page document to all beneficiaries. But if they wanted to know more, it was always there.
So they could ask for it to be sent, or they could come and see it, or
they could just ask what
was in it.
What was in it, or what they were interested in.
So what was in the office guidelines, as far as you can recall, was not public knowledge, but it was well known within the community.
Oh yeah, available to all. Yeah. Oh, undoubtedly.
Can we go, please, to MACF 5016 _ 032? So this is a minute of the NSSC on the 6th of June 2007. So right at the start, well, fairly near the start of your tenure. So it says, if we go down to the bottom of the page, please, regular payments review and costs estimates are rising. And so, second paragraph, the chief executive introduced the paper that had been circulated. Following a considered discussion, it was agreed that the following proposal should be made to the full board of trustees at their meeting. And that's the point you made earlier, that the policy is formulated here, but then approved or rejected by the full board.
Yeah.
And then the synopsis of the paper is set out in respect of monthly regular payments and appropriate supplement adjustments and the annual summer and winter payments. And
this is on the next page.
Go to the next page. Arising from the recent regular payment survey, all those with a gross household income of less than £30,000 per annum are shown as shown, or where their census form indicates, should receive the higher rate of regular payment as published, £305. In addition, this would apply to all infected intimates. So, am I right in understanding that this was a policy that ensured that primary beneficiaries, as they've been termed, i.e. people with haemophilia who were infected, and any partners who were infected, got the same rate of pay?
Mm-hmm.
All registrants and infected intimates, regardless of household income, receive the monthly supplement of £61, hitherto paid only to those receiving the higher or middle rate care component of the disability living allowance or attendance allowance, and that the supplement for a non-infected live-in partner be £30 for all registrants who would receive the higher rate of regular payment. And then for all those receiving the higher rate of regular payment, supplements for children are set out, and where an infected partner is living with the registrant and the family has dependent children, the supplement will only be paid to the registrant. And then 5, registrants with a household income of more than £30,000 per annum would receive the standard rate of £255 together with the £61 supplement, and then supplements for live-in partners and dependent child are set out for that cohort of registrants as well. So I can take you to the minute if necessary, but of the McFarlane Trust Board minute where this is accepted. But does that accord with your recollection of the regular payments that were given to infected beneficiaries during the early years?
I wouldn't have been able to tell you without seeing this, what the amounts were. But yes, it looks familiar to me. Yeah. And as you say, it's how this would have been set. Yes.
And then we go down to a situation in respect of non-infected widows. Non-infected widows would remain unchanged, and we looked at the policy in place before you came earlier in this week. The following changes: financial support would be withdrawn after 10 years and with no change in circumstances. Do you recall? Can you recall anything about why these changes were being made or being recommended?
Well, these weren't changed.
I think.
Save for the following. I beg your pardon. No, I don't. Remember. No.
And then 3 months after remarrying or entering into a stable relationship. Do you have any recollection of discussions about why support should come to an end for a widow who otherwise would qualify for support because of a new relationship?
No, is the short answer. I don't remember a discussion particularly. I think the expression that was used in, I can't now remember, it was a board meeting or in some other papers, but the concept of moving on is what that is about. That if widows were, and some chose to, anyway, wanted to move on and leave the trust behind, but in any event, if a widow did find a stable future and a supported future going forward, then it seemed right to preserve the funds of the trust to support those who were in need.
But this isn't here suggesting that the McFarlane Trust is making any investigation into the financial circumstances of the widow in the new relationship.
No,
it's the fact of the new relationship, irrespective of the financial position that the widow and new partner find themselves in.
Yeah.
So do you have any? Can you recollect why that was thought to be an appropriate policy change?
I don't recall any discussion about it. I think an assumption was made whether it was possible for a widow entering into a new relationship to make any further application to the trust. I don't know. I don't recall. This was the policy because it was based on an assumption that somebody who had remarried had moved on, in quotation marks.
And then we see discontinuance of incapacity benefit or severe disablement allowance or withdrawal of the to be introduced ESA. And then it says this: where support to dependent children is made available, this would cease when majority is achieved. Can you recall what the provisions for support to dependent children were? This suggests that it's rather discretionary. I mean, it may be available to dependent children.
It was in the regular pay, wasn't it? It was supplements to the regular pay.
Yes. So so that suggests, doesn't it, that one would get support. I think paragraph 4, for example,
And 5, yeah.
supplement would get supplements. That last the last sentence on that page makes it sound as if there may be circumstances in which dependent children wouldn't get payments. Can you help us at all with that?
I'm assuming, no, I can't directly, but without going back up the page, there were circumstances, I think, in which at a higher level of household income, that no regular pay was made at all. I can only assume that that's what that is referring to. It may also be a not very elegant drafting. It may simply mean that where there are dependent children, support would cease when majority is achieved. That's how I remember it, if I can remember it with any precision at all.
Even on that latter formulation, it is replacing dependency as the criterion for payment with the criterion of age.
Yes.
Which, not long after this, might have fallen foul, at least with the policy underlying the Equality Act. As might marital status.
As might marital status, yes. I bow to your point. It's not something that occurred to any of us, I think, at that stage. But
no, well, it plainly wouldn't have done. No advice, I imagine, was taken.
Certainly, the only advice that I recall ever being taken about the external advice, that is, was taken from the Charity Commission, because I know these sorts of policies, all these policies were shared from time to time with the Charity Commission, and for them to say they were satisfied that we were within whatever guidelines they wanted. Had not wanted. But no, I don't remember any legal advice being taken.
Well, I don't think I can go so far as to begin to suggest that it might be unlawful, but because this is a charity, it's not necessarily covered by discrimination statutes. But nonetheless, there's an element of movement of policy or opinion, which you're telling me it wasn't reflected in 2007 anyway. No one thought of it.
No.
I'm going to ask you some questions about the post-Archer position, and you've already given quite a lot of evidence in relation to that, so we might be able to deal with that quite briefly. But it's probably helpful to look at what Lord Archer's report actually says before we get to that. So can we go to ARCH 601, please? Can we go to, there we can see this is a report of the Archer inquiry published 23rd of February 2009. Can we go please to page 75? Next page, please. Here we're in chapter 9, governmental response. Financial review. I think governmental response means to the infected blood. And then if we go over to page 78, page before 70. Sorry. Yes. So if we go to the bottom of that, the last paragraph on that page. I just wanted to get your observations on these findings. The method of providing relief was flawed in two ways, and here Lord Archer is talking about the trusts and schemes. First, to provide money on an ad hoc basis to beneficiaries who could point to specific needs, savoured strongly of poor relief. Victims, some of whom before they were infected had enjoyed higher living standards and were capable of substantial earnings, were now required, as they saw it, to go cap in hand and beg for discretionary relief. However sympathetic and sensitive the trustees, the victims felt patronised. And secondly, victims of HIV also continued to feel that there remained an element of stigma attached to the condition and sometimes felt embarrassed in discussing it. Can you recall when you read this report whether either of those two findings were a surprise to you or anyone at Macfarlane Trust?
No, not at all. Not at all. That was one of the great difficulties that the trustees had in terms of administering the trust and the funds of the trust to the best of their abilities, that you couldn't avoid, particularly if we could go back. I'll just reread the beginning of that paragraph. But certainly the second, the whole idea that provision should be made for the victims of this terrible tragedy solely on the basis of being able to establish financial need, it seemed as wrong to the trustees as it did to the beneficiaries. The trustees had to do the best they could with the position they found themselves in. Yes, and the idea that they had to go cap in hand and beg for discretionary relief is just was as unacceptable to us, as I say, as it was to them. And the fact that it could point to savouring strongly of poor relief, it's the same point, but said in a different way. It was as unacceptable to us, I repeat, as it was to the beneficiaries themselves. And indeed, it was, I recall rather, there was some reason why some victims preferred not to be in touch with the trust, because they just didn't want to have to think about it anymore.
And on that point, Lord Archer is saying, well, that may be to do with the stigma.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the Macfarlane Trust, in your recollection, were well aware of that, were they?
Oh yes. Which is why we were as keen as Archer was, and why in our submission to Archer we were making exactly these points, that it's unacceptable, it should be unacceptable, on whether you call it political or moral basis, for this issue, these problems, to be dealt with in the way that was set up back in 1988-89.
Shimit, can we go to page, it's the internal pagination 108, it may be electronic 109. I'm not quite sure. Yes. So in fact, we should go back a page just to explain what we're looking at here. So Chapter 12, recommendations. We believe the following recommendations would help to meet the unmet needs of patients with haemophilia and their families. And then if we can go over to the next page, please, and the bottom of the next page. Number 6, direct financial relief. Direct financial relief should be provided for those infected and for carers who have been prevented from working. And then we propose the scheme should have the following characteristics. Can we go over the page? It should be paid through the DWP in the same way as existing statutory benefits and not through Macfarlane or Eileen Trust or Skipton Fund. The government would thus have direct responsibility of the individual beneficiaries for providing the necessary resources. Entitlement should be payable if infection is established within the appropriate time frame with an appeal mechanism, and entitlement should not be means tested but should take the form of an initial capital sum followed by prescribed periodical payments. No distinction dependent upon the reason for the treatment, and the anomalies which at present apply according to the age when the recipient was first infected or when the infection took place, etc., should be rectified. And then a reference to Eileen Trust and Skipton Fund. Payments under the scheme should be disregarded for purposes of benefits. There should be a table of amounts payable in the cases of double multiple infection. So those were the findings, the recommendations made by Lord Archer, and you have referred in your evidence to the response that the Macfarlane Trust made to the government's response to Archer. And we can see in the documentation quite a lot of toing and froing between the Department of Health and the Macfarlane Trust following the government response in May 2009. I wonder if we can just take this sort of fairly broad brush, but is this right, that the government had identified, the government's response was, well, we will give the Macfarlane Trust beneficiaries, those that are infected, primary beneficiaries, those that are infected, £12,800 per annum.
Mm-hmm.
And the Macfarlane Trust response was, well, that's not enough. We don't think that's enough. You should give them more, something like £16,000 to £18,000 per annum.
Yeah, the reason for our picking that number was not because it was a perfect number, but it was what we saw as what their response, we saw that to be what we saw their response to logically require, which was to double the payments that the infected beneficiaries, the primary beneficiaries, had been having. And we tried at length to explain to them why their figure was wrong.
Yes.
And that it ought to be the higher number, and on the basis that we thought the higher number would actually get much closer to what we understood Archer to be saying. You know, we didn't know what Archer didn't put a figure on it, but that's what we thought was consistent with his approach as well. And so, yes, that was the thrust of our. There was a number of exchanges with the department and with ministers about that, but it got nowhere. I say it did get somewhere in the sense that I believe this was sequential. You'll correct me if I'm wrong. That they did then say, well, we'll give you some more money, Macfarlane Trust that is, to dispense on a discretionary basis to make up some of the difference. But
and is this right, or do you recall this, that's right? What the department then ended up saying to you, well, look, here's a pot of money, out of which comes all the £12,800 payments per annum, and you, Macfarlane Trust, can have the rest to disperse as you see fit, in accordance with your charitable objectives.
Exactly.
And is this right, that you went back to the department saying, well, that means then that we have to apply the criterion of need to those top-up payments? Could you not just give them more on a non-discretionary basis, so that need doesn't come into it, and referring at that stage to the Archer recommendations, that these payments should not be means tested.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it was that argument, was it, that fell on deaf ears?
Yeah.
So the position post Archer.
Well, both arguments did. You know, the argument about the numbers and the fact that they were inconsistent and illogical fell on deaf ears, and then the response to say that, well, we'll give you some more discretionary funding, and our reaction to that, well, that puts us in the difficult position, because you know all these people have got these annual sums which we can't ignore when we have to try and establish need, and that makes it puts us in a difficult position, as against some who feel very much in need, but arguably might not be if you were going to try and be strict in the charitable interpretation of need, and as against others who clearly were still in need. So it just was a very unsatisfactory. The government response did not deal with the fundamental issue which Archer had pointed out, and which you've just was apparent from those two sentences that we looked at a bit earlier.
And I do want to ask you a bit in a bit more detail about the assessment of need and so on. Looking at the time, that's probably going to be after lunch, but if we can just establish as a matter of fact what post Archer Macfarlane beneficiaries were getting in terms of financial assistance. So there was the £12,800 per annum, which is often referred to as the non-discretionary payment, which was given by government through the MFET. Didn't come via Macfarlane Trust.
No.
And then the
And that was because we couldn't do it through a charity. It's not possible to do that through a charity.
Through a charity.
Certainly not through our charity, anyway.
And then the Macfarlane Trust were giving top-ups, is that right?
Yeah.
To and this is to the infected community.
Yes.
Top-ups to the infected community, tapered depending on their household income.
Yeah.
So, and the bands were in bands of £7,000, 7 to 14, 14 to 21, 21 to 28. Is that right?
That's what I recall, yes.
Yeah. And so if you were in a particular band, your top-up was a particular amount.
Yeah. You've only got to say all that to realise just how unsatisfactory it was.
And this is sticking for a moment with the infected beneficiaries. There was also the opportunity to apply for single grants to the Macfarlane Trust, but those were given in exceptional circumstances.
Yes.
Then I think we're going to need a document for the non-infected community because it gets perhaps slightly more complicated. Can we have MACF 5047_017? And can we have, please, page 8 of this? This is the annual financial report, year ending 31st of March 2011. And if we go to page 8 of that document, yes, we have, if we move down the page, support to non-infected beneficiaries. So in that second paragraph there, we have the first element of support is that trustees determine that payments should continue to be made to a widow or a family carer, which would have the effect of ensuring that the value of a deceased's beneficiary household of the non-discretionary payments received before his death would be maintained for 12 months. In other words, if a primary beneficiary dies, the MFET non-discretionary payment would presumably stop. The Macfarlane Trust guaranteed that payment to the bereaved family for 12 months. Is that what that says?
That's my understanding, yes.
So and then secondly, in addition, the trustees adopted a policy which was backdated to effect from the 20th of May 2009, providing financial assistance for all those widows whose household income were less than £15,000. Is this right, that the policy was to bring the income up to £15,000? Can you recall that?
I can't. I suspect that is what it meant, but I honestly can't remember. I think that must have been it, but forgive me, I don't remember.
And then, well, it may help the last sentence. The last sentence of that paragraph, in fact. And then it says, since this year end, a clearer understanding having been obtained of the numbers involved, the target level of minimum net income has been increased to £18,000.
No, I'm pretty sure now that we've gone through that does accord with my recollection. Yeah.
Okay, so that was the two provisions for widows. And again, do we understand that that's all widows, irrespective of whether they have children, irrespective of whether they're incapacitated, etc.?
That is what my understanding was, yes.
And then we come on in the next paragraph to children. Trustees continue the policy of making regular monthly payments for the benefit of children who have lost one or both of their parents at the rate of £3,000 per annum for the first child, £1,200 per annum for each subsequent child. And then, in addition, a new policy for the benefit of children of living infected beneficiaries, most of whom are receiving regular discretionary payments for themselves. That must refer to the infected beneficiaries, of regular monthly payments at the rate of £1,200 per annum. So, in other words, infected beneficiaries have a supplement, in a sense, if they have children living with them.
Mm. And widows, presumably, and widows.
Yeah. Well, I think that's children living with infected beneficiaries.
Was it? Okay, sorry.
Can you recall, because the annual report is silent on this, whether or not there was the opportunity for the bereaved community or the bereaved independent community, the non-infected community, to apply for single grants after Archer?
No, I can't. I'm afraid.
What?
I mean, sorry. Just reading that again, that paragraph at the top of the page indicates that they could, yes. So, total amount disbursed by the trust in support of a total of 134 widows and dependents in the year under review, including single grants for those with specific needs, is 806,000.
Thank you.
And the previous year, 229 to 121. Sorry, that's what I thought. Yeah.
And you've made the references on a number of occasions, but I think you've said that the consequence of this policy of now giving regular payments to widows, irrespective of whether or not they were incapacitated or had dependent children, brought back into the fold a number of widows who had not had support from McFarlane Trust for some years.
Yeah.
And you've explained that you had to find those widows because they weren't.
Well, we set out to. I mean, because as I recall, our national advertising produced exactly no applicants.
Can you recall where you advertised? No. Which newspapers?
No, to be honest. No.
Can you recall whether any consideration was given to ensuring that the advertisements covered Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales as well as England?
Well, I have to believe they did, but what the newspapers were and what their circulation was, I don't know. But I only say this, perhaps lightheartedly is the wrong word in the circumstances, but we had one of the trustees was, if you like, representative of Scotland, and he would have been very sure to make it clear that anything we were doing. And he was actually very close, as I recall, to the community in Scotland. And these communities would have known, the bereaved communities would have been, many of them would have known others who were no longer either chosen to or were no longer chosen to be supported or were no longer supported by the trust, and others who never had been. So my guess is that is the more likely route through which new applicants came in. It was just known within the communities. And certainly the Haemophilia Society would, as far as McFarlane Trust beneficiaries or bereaved beneficiaries were concerned, they certainly had a mechanism for, not a mechanism, a way of keeping in touch, a means of keeping in touch with all of the people with whom they had been engaged, as it were, in the past. And they would have done their best to try to make sure that those who did qualify or could qualify would come forward. But it took time. I'd be interested to know one day just how many, 3 years later, how many more widows had finally come forward. Because from memory, we've got 134 widows and dependents, and then as compared with 121. And we were expecting, I think we've referred to it in a previous document, that there'd be at least 200 widows only, alone, I mean, regardless of dependents, coming forward. So it was slow progress.
So I note the time, and I was going to move on to looking at the assessment of needs. So
Well,
Might be
we'll take a break there. We'll take an hour. That'll be long enough for you to.
Oh, absolutely.
The usual rules will apply during the break. That is that you mustn't talk to anyone about the evidence you've given or you think you may yet be asked to give. Anything else is fine.
Very good. Very good. I understand that.
So, 2 o'clock.
2 o'clock.